Welcome to the Impact on the Ground podcast series. I'm Tiia Sammalahti, CEO of whatimpact.com, a tech for good company with the mission to become the LinkedIn of CSR. In this podcast series, we'll dig deeper into what it takes to make an impactful change in our society. I'll give a voice to charities, social enterprises, companies, grantmakers, individuals, and government officials who all have one thing in common. They are keen to make a difference. We dive into practical solutions and observe the dynamics of those who have resources to give and those working with the beneficiaries on the ground. Let's start making an impact together. So today on Impact on the Ground, we have a guest who knows everything about grant giving. Our author of a book called Modern Grantmaking, Gemma Bull. Welcome, Gemma.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, amazing to talk to you about this grant giving. It's such a big topic and important topic. If we think about the billions of pounds are given to charities, social enterprises, and unregistered community groups annually in the UK to solve all kind of environmental and social problems, but we yet know very little about kind of how is it all done, and also then if there are any kind of challenges in the grant making market that maybe could be solved or some practices that could be improved. And I guess you have lots of ideas about it because you wrote a book about it. But please tell us about your background. What makes you passionate about grant giving?
Well, actually, I got interested in grants after spending over 10 years working for charities. And I started working for charities because I got involved with an LGBT plus youth group when I was at school. And that led to me undertaking a master's in human rights and then working for a range of international charities. And it was while working for charities that I became more aware of these things we call grants, both in terms of writing applications for them and managing them. And after experiencing that, the highs and lows that come with that for quite a long time, I saw a job opportunity come up to work with a place called the National Lottery Community Fund, which is the largest community funder in the UK, to support that organisation to try and make its funding more flexible and accessible. And I thought, wow, with all the sort of experiences I've had, that sounds like something that needs to happen. And so I ended up going and working there, and I was funding strategy director for quite a few years at the fund before my co-author and I, Tom Steinberg, decided to write this book about modern grant making that you mentioned. And it's a practical guide for any grant maker who's keen on improving their skills and their practices, and who's also interested in contributing to sort of wider reform efforts to try and make grant making more transparent, equitable, and accessible, like I mentioned.
And that's, I think, a interesting viewpoint that you look at it from the grant maker perspective and not just like, oh, here is how you apply for these grants. So kind of what we have learned in whatimpact.com is that, we've been doing quite a lot of research and surveys and stuff, and it is so that the organizations on the ground doing the beneficiary work are overwhelmed with application processes, applying for different grants, which may be sometimes very small, and then comparison to the workload what you have to put into, there is like no sense, and reporting back. But let's define first, what is a grant? So everybody who is listening kind of understands what is the difference between grant and just money donation?
That's a good question. Well, I think some people would say that some grants are donations because grants are effectively a way of giving money to something that an organization is interested in. That could be a foundation, it could be a foundation run by a family, it could be a corporate foundation, it could be government giving away grants to try and have a particular impact. But the types of grants that organizations can give can be very different. You can have something called unrestricted funding, where a grant will be given that may have actually no restrictions, like I said, in terms of how it should be spent. It's just given to an organization or sometimes an individual person in line with the mission that organization has. But you can also have restricted funding, and that's funding where there are sort of strings attached to it. You can only spend it on certain things within a certain deadline. And even with any type of grant, unrestricted or restricted, the person or organization giving the grant may want some things in return. So they might want some monitoring data, they might want some evaluation data. So grants are a way of giving money to try and help something happen, but the types of grants are kind of infinite, and people working for charities will have strong views on what kind of grants they prefer to get.
Okay, so what is then a difference for company setting up a foundation or giving direct donations? What's the difference? Why should they consider these options?
Yeah, good question. I think it very much depends on what any organization is trying to achieve, right? And that should help them think about, well, okay, is this a route we want to go down in terms of grants? Do we want to take more of an investor approach? What are we actually trying to achieve? And I think if an organization is trying to support, in particular, non-profit organizations or charities working in a particular field to keep doing what they're doing or to learn or to improve as well, then giving them flexible grants could be a really helpful way of doing that. Because, of course, there are a range of charities, let's say operating in the UK, where having sort of the notion of rolling income is just unrealistic, right? It doesn't exist in terms of what they're trying to achieve. So grants can actually be a really important way of helping them to get the money, that they need to do their work. So if you're an organization thinking about, should I be investing in something? Should I be considering grants? What type of grants? That really needs to kind of tie back to your mission, your CSR approach. What are you looking to do? And that should help to sort of define, right, okay, what's the potential approach we might want to take here?
Yeah. Okay, so when you've been writing this book, you probably interviewed a lot of people and did research, not just based on your own experience. So what is your message in the book for grant makers? What are the challenges those applicants are facing, and what should grant makers do about it?
Just a few questions there. No, why not? Throw them at me. That's great. They're the really important ones. So the book, okay, Modern Grantmaking, that Tom Steinberg and I developed, is very much based on just under 100 perspectives of grant makers in this country, US, Canada, far wider than that, as well as people working for very different types of nonprofits. One of the things that we realized was that while there's an awful lot of books written about philanthropy, they're often written sort of with the needs and interests of billionaires or people who sit on boards and sort of what they're interested in. And there's actually very little by way of practical advice and tips for everyday grant maker. I mean, there's one, Darren Walker, in terms of the Ford Foundation, but there's hundreds of grant makers that work there. So we started off by testing that sort of assumption. Do you think there's a need for practical support about how to do this grant making job well? And we got lots of positive feedback saying yes. And so we started doing interviews, and it's from the interviews that we developed up actually how the book is structured. So the book responds to key questions that grant makers commonly raised. How do we make a better experience for sort of grant seekers and grantees? How do I lead well? How do I lead a grant making team well? How do I help develop, a really effective strategy? What are the values that should underpin grant making? So that's actually how the book is structured in response to what people were saying they wanted more information about. And indeed, the book is absolutely sort of full of case studies, quotes, opinions. Each chapter ends with a very practical checklist for people to sort of refer to. Tom and I do say on occasion, this is what we actually think, but it's less about us. It's more about what people were saying they need. Tom and I both have a design background. And so we're very used to sort of researching people's needs, communities' needs. And so the book is developed in response to grant maker needs. It's not a sort of editorial opinion piece.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's cool. About this kind of grant maker, kind of, how would I say, motivation and interest. In our research, the recipient organizations, the charities applying for them are sometimes, they feel kind of that they are neglected. They don't get any responses. They are wasting their time. Nobody's advising and stuff. What is the reason for this kind of experience? In that side of
we
the
have a whole chapter on that.
yeah. So what is the reason? Why do they feel that way? And if the grant makers recognize this, why don't they change something? Or is this a very challenging thing?
Yeah, no, very good question. So we have a whole chapter, as I mentioned, on redesigning your grant making, both kind of services, systems, all sorts of stuff. And so often I think some of these issues are caused by the fact that funders don't see themselves as providing a service to grant seekers and grantees. Some funders still think that people are quote unquote lucky to get their money. And if you have that mindset, you're less likely to develop, if you have an application process, a process that's actually accessible, useful, easy for anyone to complete. You'll probably concoct something that's operationally easier for you. And so I think oftentimes that can be one of the main problems. Actually, let's take an online application form. It may never have been designed with the people that are meant to use it. Yeah. There are also a kind of shockingly large number of foundations that still don't have accessible websites, even if they do have forms online. So this is all down to sort of not recognizing that you're actually providing a service of sorts. And we suggest in the book very strongly, and we heard it very strongly from the people we interviewed, that more funders not only should adopt this sort of service mindset, but they should also really think of themselves working in partnership with charities. Because actually, if the charities didn't exist, or movements or networks or whoever they're funding, what would they be doing? So it's sort of a lofty attitude, kind of, you've got to scale our fortress walls, as it were. It's just unhelpful for everyone concerned. So that's one element of it. The good news is, through developing the book, we actually saw lots and lots of examples of funders and grant makers who are trying to do things very differently. So I think traditional grant making, if I can put it like that, does have a problem with sort of not understanding that they should be providing a service. But there are lots of organizations who have decided that that's important, because they've recognized that we can't achieve our mission if we're not actually able to kind of find and support and work with the organizations that would help us to do that. So actually, that's on us. We need to think about the power imbalance and how we design things to make it easier for the people that we want to work with to apply, get to know us, build relationships. And so what's really fascinating is you've got examples of sort of new funding organizations that have been developed recently, such as Resourcing Racial Justice in this country, who have taken a very different approach to sort of seeking kind of match funding and developing what they're doing, which is more kind of based on interviewing funders and their values, rather than sort of the other way around, which are funders are used to interviewing and kind of questioning applicants. But then you've also got organizations that have sort of been around a while, but that are actually recognizing, like I said, we want to do things differently because we're sort of hearing that we need to make a real difference. And there's a bit of a reckoning going on in grant making and philanthropy. And they're sort of tuned into that rather than sort of head in the sands. And so there's a whole range of funders who have taken sort of design skills and more participatory approaches and sort of use that in terms of changing and improving what they do, right down from community foundations through to lottery distributors. So it's not all doom and gloom. I think there are people and organizations that are changing, and campaigns like #FixTheForm, which have been all about trying to encourage funders to show questions in their application forms up front, #ShiftThePower, #FundingSoWhite. Things like this are really important, because one of the problems you mentioned sort of, I think briefly in one of the questions was, I would say grant making does have a general issue with openness and transparency. There actually aren't many incentives. There aren't many carrots or sticks to sort of encourage funders to sort of be as transparent perhaps as they could be about what they're doing and why. And so these campaigns and these initiatives that I've mentioned and movements like the Grant Givers movement in the UK are fantastic, because they help to shine a light both within grant making and from outside about, this isn't good enough. It's probably never been good enough, but it's definitely not good enough now. And we all need to change and make it better. Otherwise, grant making is sort of at risk of sort of falling behind and not making this positive contribution that so many people think and want it to make.
Yeah, so we at What Impact have tried to tackle this with our platform product a lot. This first of all, application process, that it would be streamlined, and on our website, charities and social enterprise are applying with their profiles, which are quite extensive, but have also open data pulled to them, and it's a public domain. So there is the transparency aspect on both on applicants, but then also the grant maker is exposed in the grants and the criteria right there for everyone. So there wouldn't be like hidden grants. And this kind of automated like matchmaking, and you can be put on the short list, you can be rejected instantly, you can, you even get the grant, and then you report back on the same platform with the semi-automated impact reporting. That's the efficiency. But what we have faced when we've been promoting this to grant makers, it seems that their interest sometimes is not to make their work more efficient, because they have a job to do. They don't consider that maybe saving costs or maybe saving cost and time from the other side is kind of their job. And that has been kind of a little hurdle here in terms of, growing the number of users on Grantmakers, because they don't see that important. Did this factor somehow came about in your interviews?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. One of the issues I think sometimes is that funders, even if they do recognize that, let's say there's externalized costs, if you like, in terms of the sort of processes that they create, particularly for, charities that may be wanting to apply to them, they may recognize this, but they don't feel the pain. It's the charities that do. So I think that's what makes it hard, like I said, around carrot and sticks, to encourage funders to think about, what could they do? What should they do to make the whole process easier? I think what can work is showing funders very clear examples of where this is going wrong, rather than in a general sense. So when I worked at the Community Fund, we gathered a lot of very useful and important information about how applicants were navigating the website, trying to answer questions from all the sort of ways that you would expect: observation, tracking how people were using the website. Obviously, we couldn't see who they were, but we could see what they were trying to do. And actually, from inside, being able to discuss that with colleagues and show them how people were struggling to use the processes that we put in place. I found that did work and can work, but funders need to see it rather than sort of just be told generally. They need to be shown directly how what they have created specifically isn't working as well as it could. And then through that, you can also find ways to say, like you were just mentioning, and by the way, you might have had this process for 10 years, but it's actually wasting you a lot of time and money as well. And you can sort of introduce that. But I think with funders, everybody likes to think they're unique. And so showing them the unique failings, if you like, of what they're doing can be a way to help sort of change hearts and minds. I think a general conversation about externalized costs is very difficult.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising, because then in the kind of like a commercial company world, it's obviously it's the bottom line that matters, and you kind of try to make admin costs reduced, and you take a lot of systems to support your efficiency. But in this segment, it seems that there is not that kind of pressure. And I would kind of here shout to the trustees then, and see that, it's their job to make sure that the funding pot, what you have, would mainly go to the social and environmental and cultural value provided, rather than their own admin. Because then again, many grant makers don't want to fund the charity's admin, but they are funding their own.
That's another huge issue. I think there's a couple of things there, if I could just build on what you're saying. So I think it really depends on the funder. Again, if you've got leaders at all different stages, including people on the board, who really do think that their ability to sort of achieve their mission, their goals, is intimately tied in the ability to provide a good service and support partners to do good work, then they will have a very different attitude often to the notion of improvement, learning, than to others who just don't think like that at the moment and are very used to sort of putting in place systems that just accrete over time. Do they just get more and more stuff built onto them rather than, having a review and going, actually, who's this designed for? Is this benefiting anybody? On the admin point for funders, it's an interesting one. I mean, of course, there are funders, I'm sure, that could be more efficient in terms of what they're doing, but there's also some funders who are potentially the opposite. You could have a scenario where there's a funder that wants to be very community-based, place-based, but also in their mind thinks, well, obviously we should be giving the vast majority of our funding via grants, but sometimes that can lead funders to not make the right choices about their own people, and actually you need people with skills and time to be able to build community relationships. So I think, again, it's a bit like what we were just saying about what should organizations do? Should they give grants? Should they think about other ways of supporting sort of charitable endeavors? I think as a funder, it very much the way that you work must relate to your mission, and you've got to design it like that. And that runs right through from sort of your board and strategy, the people that make decisions every day, through to how you develop your application form if you have one, ideally.
Yeah, that's a very, very, very good point. That also, it's not just given that if you are, let's say, a foundation, you have to just like put out grants. You can, of course, build even training systems and different kind of courses. You can do co-funding practices and various different kind of things, or even lend some money for a commercial projects or something, because a lot of charities and social enterprises need, yes, grants, but they also are looking for money that they can pay back eventually, because they do trade and they will have like even trading income. So they are looking for social impact lenders as well. So there are a lot of ways to support for sure. You mentioned the restricted and non-restricted grants, and since we've been working with charities so many years, and giving advice, and a lot of course, companies who help through us do also skills-based volunteering. And what we have come across, that sometimes it might be quite large charity, but they have really, really tiny, like the administrative or voluntary income budget. So then everything is so restricted that even if they have to buy a £50 software, they just literally don't have money for that £50 because it's not part of any of the grant funding projects. And they have to report every single bus ticket back to the grant funder that, this 250 went to this bus ticket. So it's very, very admin heavy model, this restriction. What do you think about this kind of a scenario?
I think my answer won't surprise you. Almost the number one thing that we heard in developing the book Modern Grantmaking was that both actually grantmakers on the whole and people working for nonprofits thought that unrestricted funding should just be the norm for most funders. There are some scenarios where certain types of restrictions maybe make sense, but for the vast majority of funders and grants, unrestricted funding could just be so useful for the organizations. What you described, unfortunately, is reality. And so in the book, there's a chapter that's called What Are the No-Brainers of Modern Grantmaking? And number one in that list is more funders should give unrestricted funding. There was a recent report by an organization known as IVAR just this month, actually, which is very interesting because it's all about how are funders doing unrestricted funding. And there's some really interesting case studies in there that relate to what trustees think about it, as well as everyday grant makers and nonprofit organizations. And there are funders like the Peter Cundall Foundation who relatively recently moved from a more restricted model to an unrestricted model. And so there's lots of possibilities here in terms of how you can do it, even if it's not the way that you were originally set up. And it would be one way to reduce some of the externalized costs that we were just talking about. I mean, let's be honest. As I said, I started off working for charities. The amount of applications that a sort of regular charity has to put in just to stay alive is enormous. Because of the competitive nature of funding, you don't know what will be successful, what won't. The number of applications you can supply for unrestricted funding is very small compared to restricted, and all the restricted elements are sort of variations on a theme, different percentages for different things. You're trying to put together this sort of patchwork, which is just not the true story of your work. Yeah. And so what funders are doing is that too often they are encouraging charities to have to concoct a different reality to serve their needs, rather than actually saying, we want to help you because we actually both have shared goals. How can we help you?
Yeah. And I guess everybody's looking for kind of like co-funding opportunities in that sense. That's a very popular theme that you want other organizations to invest in. And at the moment, kind of the company market is, of course, coming strongly because of the CSR programs are developing. There has to be a social mission within any organization, but also the government procurement policy note that came to an effect early this year. Companies have to deliver social value for if they are bidding for government tenders or working as a contractor for government. So companies are strongly coming to the market, which has been traditionally funded by Grantmakers. And what we see is that, of course, that company might actually give £50,000 worth of IT services for free. Yeah, that could be their donation, which would cost them less than 50,000. They wouldn't give 50,000 maybe as money, but they could do the work. But if the charity has a restricted funding and they had marked down that 50,000 has to be outsourced IT services, they couldn't change it to some other cost. Yeah, so they couldn't take the 50,000 service package because they will be losing the funding because they wouldn't be doing that what they described in the application maybe 1.5 years before or something. So there should be flexibility. So the charity could be more agile, also taking in free resources, which might not be money, but they might be skills, products, and services. And I think that's kind of one aspect that should be considered, that if you get something for free, why would you pay for it? Because that money can be then put into other use. But
yeah, well, you've just described one of the major issues of restricted funding, which is it is not a model that by definition can help you respond to need and adapt. And actually, many of these organizations we're talking about, they are regularly all the time responding to people in community, needs that they're working with. So that's a major issue. I mean, it may be the case with some funders that you could actually say, look, this opportunity's come up, and have that conversation. But with some, of course, that still wouldn't be possible. And that is why, as I said in the book, the number one no-brainer of modern grant making is give unrestricted funding if you can. And if you're a funder and you're just kind of coming to these conversations, just start to really investigate and explore, why do we have these restrictions? Why did they come about? What do we need them for? Do we need them? Because as I mentioned before, in terms of sort of application processes and sort of funding systems, things can often accrete over time because there aren't those processes put in place to review, and particularly review with the people who are meant to be using these systems and services. And so sort of the same goes for restricted funding. Why is it like this? Does it need to be like this? Is it helping us to keep achieving our mission? What are we hearing from our grantees about how useful this funding is?
We've been we as a company, but the whole market, I think, has been really pushing charities and social enterprises to better measure and report on the impact. And it's been, really kind of hyped up by all umbrella bodies. They're training organizations that you have to report on impact, you have to measure, because otherwise you won't be getting funding. How do Grantmakers see this? Are they up to date themselves?
Yeah, another question that's very, very good and quite difficult in a way. I can share what we learned from the book. I wouldn't describe myself as a sort of impact or evaluation expert, just to be completely honest. I mean, in terms of funders, again, it depends on how their grant making is being designed in terms of what they ask for. Often funders separate this notion of monitoring from impact. So monitoring is kind of data on, outputs, numbers of people, that kind of thing, which can also have its flaws. And then the impact side is often associated with outcomes. I think one of the things that I think more funders could do is recognize that they're almost always contributing to something. You were talking about companies before that might have 50,000 to offer in terms of skill, or perhaps it could be a grant. I mean, £50,000 is a lot of money on one hand, but on the other, going towards some huge social injustice, maybe a drop in the ocean. So when it comes to sort of impact, I think funders could be a little bit more humble sometimes there. In the book, we have a chapter that's called "What Do I Do About Research?" And some of the key learnings that we included in that from speaking with all these grant makers and people working for nonprofits was that evidence and research, it all comes down to where you work and the kind of culture of the organization and what you're expected to do. So for some funders, that are very data driven and sort of focused on evidence, let's say like the Education Endowment Fund in the UK, they will have a different set of skills when it comes to research and evidence, and a different set of expectations than a very small family foundation might, or a very sort of localized place-based funder. And that's fine. One of the main issues that we came across was actually, and this may surprise you and some people or not, many grant makers felt that their organization didn't actually support them to sort of improve their own research skills and to actually have the time to be able to review the evidence base when they were making decisions on types of grants. And that sort of sometimes wasn't built into the process. Of course, in some cases, that's what people do all the time. But oftentimes people were saying, we're so snowed down with all this admin and bureaucracy that the idea that I can, look up the evidence base for however many grants every time, it's just not designed like that, which is in a way a bit shocking, but is apparently a reality. Another thing that we found was that one of the things that's very common in grants is that a funder might say, yes, we'll give you a grant for X, have 10% to do monitoring and evaluation. Now, for some charities, that might be okay, but for those that are actually working on something that does require a different level of research to understand the potential impact, maybe there needs to be a control study or a different type of study because of the work that's already been undertaken in that space. That is a bit of a problem, potentially, we suggest. And actually, we think funders should take more responsibility and work with the organisations to support them to think about the kind of evidence and research that they might want to undertake, but then the funder can pay for and support a third party, an expert third party, to do that. Sometimes there's too much expectations on charities to mark their own homework, which may not help in terms of the wider evidence debate. Now, we're not suggesting there that we think that organisations shouldn't be in control of their own learning or their own data or their own improvement. Of course not. We're just saying for some things, funders, we think, too often have taken a bit of a lax attitude and just passed the burden of evidence and impact onto their grantees, rather than thinking with their grantees, what is the evidence in this space? How can we work with you to contribute to this evidence base? What's missing? What's the next study? That isn't necessary for a one-off community party, but it might be for quite a serious study about what can help to prevent youth violence, for instance.
Yeah, definitely. And this impact measurement is, of course, very tricky because it depends what is the KPI you're measuring. You might be measuring a wrong KPI kind of related to the impact you're trying to make. And that then, of course, derails the whole kind of a situation of analysis. So it is very, very tricky. But I also kind of would like to remind that why the impact reporting and actually measurement was originally kind of lifted up as an important topic is, of course, the learning of a charity of Indeed. Their own work.
Yes.
So it's a secondary than reporting to some funder kind of what your results are.
It should be, but I think sometimes it doesn't feel like that, does it? To the charity?
Yeah. So it's kind of like you should be learning. And also, we have demonstrated very many cases when we've been talking with charities, and there might be even negative impact of something, but it's actually either it then helps the charity to do things better, right, or it might reveal that there is a need for a totally other kind of service.
Yes. Yeah.
And kind of that is a positive thing. It's amazing
absolutely.
To have negative impact. And even when we were doing our impact reporting, somebody says that, who would fill in this negative impact like a data field? And I thought, of course, it has to be filled. And if you say that everything is just dancing on roses and we were doing everything perfectly, nobody believes in that, because life is not perfect. There will be something that came about as negative, but then what do you learn from it? Or is there something new that you could develop in order to tackle that negative? Because it might be that the best and good outcomes anyway overlap the negative like multiple times, but you just have to then manage the negative bit of things. But yeah, very, very tricky. And I think, yes, I sympathize also with Grantmakers, like you said, in this case that, they are burdened with thousands of applications and reading them through. And of course, do you think that the good bit writing, I would say, grant bit writing is the key here? If they don't check your evidence, you could be just writing really nice applications.
Well, I think it depends on the funder. I mean, I've certainly spoken to both, again, grant makers and people working for nonprofits that have sort of said, well, the best person with a pen, metaphorically, is going to, win the grant. And if you've got a professional fundraiser, or you do this or you do that, it really depends on the funder, and it depends how they make decisions. I mean, some grant makers, it isn't just kind of remote application based. They have conversations. Also some give power away through more participatory methods in all different kind of shapes and sizes. So it really depends on the funder and their approach. But I do think there is an issue with how applications, if they're written, are presented. And I've certainly sat myself in meetings where people have commented on spelling and, haven't recognized their own biases. And actually, again, in the book, we have a story about how a funder made a wrong decision, an organization that they probably should have done based on, what they were interested in, because of assumptions and biases they had about how an application was written.
Yeah. And I guess, like, even me as a person with having English as a second language, I sometimes, dread, there will be mistakes, and something doesn't look like perfect. But because of lack of time, I cannot ask everybody to check, or somebody to check every single email, for instance, that I'm sending, just because everything has to be correct. You have to kind of trust, the recipient's kind of understanding of the situation, that somebody might be dyslexic, somebody has second language or third language or whatever, and it's not about how the thing is written. It's about the impact and what kind of work the charity actually delivers on the ground. And to be honest, I would be very worried that if you do very impactful youth work, for instance, or social work somewhere with people who have really difficult life situations, you suddenly would be the best writer in the world and very good in all kind of admin, because these kind of skills don't go together.
You make a very good point. I mean, how would there be a correlation between how effective somebody is at providing youth work and sort of like, no spelling and typos in an application? I mean, they don't. But the issue is that for so much of grant making, everything is sort of built on the written word. And why is it when actually the work that's being supported is so different? And so I do think sometimes we do need to step back and really question the fundamental principles and assumptions underpinning things. I mean, the answer for that is because it's convenient for funders, right? So that, that's why I applaud funders and organizations that are really seriously questioning everything they do, from the investments that they have, the history of the organization, if that's relevant, through to, how they work day to day with people, how they have conversations, what kind of application form do we have? What are we asking in terms of sort of monitoring and impact? What's our culture like at the funder? Is it how we want it to be based on the kind of brand we have and how we talk about ourselves? I really applaud those funders. And I want ideally more funders to question themselves rather than just continue as things have always been, because, as you said, how things have always been doesn't really support sort of accessibility and equity.
Well, I think it's a good end statement for this podcast. Thank you, Gemma, so much. And where can people buy this book, Modern Grantmaking?
Sure. Well, people can find out more at moderngrantmaking.com. So that's a website that includes info on all the chapters and gives you information about how you can buy it.
Okay. All right. And Gemma Bull, you are found on LinkedIn if somebody wants to approach you.
Yes, that's right. And on Twitter.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for this conversation, and I'm sure this conversation continues in social media and so on, and on the channels that we will be sharing this podcast, and we will be also sharing this as a YouTube interview. Thank you so much, and speak to you soon.
Thank you very much.